What if everything you thought you earned through hard work and integrity was actually handed to you by your worst enemy? What if your biggest success was just the setup for your most devastating fall? Tonight, I'm bringing you the story of Sarah Mitchell, a marketing executive who thought she was climbing the ladder of success, only to discover she was walking straight into the most elaborate psychological trap ever orchestrated by a billionaire sociopath. Picture this. You're invited to the most exclusive gala in Manhattan. You're wearing diamonds worth more than your annual salary. The most powerful man in your industry is about to promote you to heights you never imagined possible. And then, in front of hundreds of New York's elite, he destroys everything you've ever worked for, your business, your marriage, your reputation, with a single speech. But here's the twist that will keep you listening until the very end. This wasn't random cruelty. This was a calculated 6-month psychological experiment designed to prove that even the most ethical person can be broken when the stakes get high enough. Sarah's story isn't just about corporate corruption or workplace manipulation. It's about what happens when you discover that your entire life has been choreographed by someone who sees you as nothing more than a lab rat in his twisted social experiment. And more importantly, it's about what happens when that lab rat decides to fight back. Over the next hour, you'll witness the most sophisticated psychological warfare ever documented. And you'll discover whether integrity can survive when everything you love is used as a weapon against you. This is the billionaire's betrayal. And I promise you, the ending will surprise you. Sarah Mitchell stared at the embossed invitation in her trembling hands, the heavy cardstock feeling like a passport to a world she had only glimpsed from the outside. Derek Sterling's promotion gala at the Grand Atoria Hotel. Black tie required. The gold lettering seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights of her modest Queens apartment kitchen. "Mike, you absolutely need to see this," she called to her husband, who was helping their 6-year-old twins, Emma and Jake, with their homework at the small wooden table that served as both dining surface and workspace in their cramped 2-bedroom home. Mike looked up from Emma's math worksheet, his reading glasses sliding down his nose in the way that had become endearingly familiar over their 8 years of marriage. As a freelance journalist, he had been struggling to find steady work for the past 18 months, leaving Sarah as the primary breadwinner for their family of 4. The weight of that responsibility had been pressing down on both of them, creating tensions they were still learning to navigate. "What is it, babe?" Mike asked, setting down his pencil and giving Sarah his full attention. Sarah handed him the invitation, her marketing director instincts already calculating the infinite possibilities this represented. "Derek Sterling personally invited me to his chairman promotion party. Do you understand what this could mean for Mitchell Marketing Solutions?" Mike whistled low, impressed despite his usual skepticism about the business world's power players. "The Derek Sterling? The guy who turned that small tech startup into a $5 billion empire in less than a decade? The exact same one. His company just became our biggest client last month, and this invitation means he sees serious potential in our firm." Sarah's voice carried a hope she had not allowed herself to feel in years. The constant stress of making ends meet, of stretching every dollar and delaying every dream, had worn them both down. "Mike, this could literally change everything for us." Their twins, Emma and Jake, looked up from their homework with the innocent curiosity that only 6-year-olds possessed. Emma had inherited Sarah's determined chin and thoughtful brown eyes, while Jake had Mike's unruly dark hair and mischievous grin. "Mommy, are we going to be rich like the people on television?" Emma asked, her crayon poised over a drawing of what appeared to be a rainbow-colored castle. Sarah knelt down to her daughter's level, smoothing back Emma's soft dark hair and meeting her eyes with the gentle honesty she tried to bring to all their conversations about money and security. "We're already rich, sweetheart, because we have each other and we have love in our family. But this might help Mommy's business grow bigger, which could mean Daddy can spend more time writing his stories without worrying about paying for groceries and rent." Mike set down the invitation and wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Sarah, you absolutely deserve this recognition. You've worked 18-hour days building that business from nothing, while I figured out how to make freelance journalism actually pay the bills." The weight of their financial struggles had been pressing down on their marriage for nearly 2 years now. Student loans from both their college educations, childcare costs that seemed to increase monthly, and Mike's inconsistent income had forced them to delay dreams, stretch every dollar until it screamed, and have difficult conversations about priorities and sacrifices. This invitation represented more than just a social event or even a business opportunity. It was validation, it was hope, and it was the possibility of finally breathing freely again. There's just one significant problem, Sarah said, biting her lower lip in the way she always did when wrestling with a challenge. It's black tie required. I don't exactly have an evening gown hanging in my closet next to my Target work clothes and my yoga pants. Mike smiled and kissed the top of her head, inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with the coffee she drank throughout her long workdays. Then we'll figure it out together, like we always do. Maybe your sister Jennifer can lend you something from her corporate wardrobe, or we can find one of those dress rental places in Manhattan. Sarah pulled out her phone and began calculating the costs, her mind automatically running through spreadsheets and budgets. A dress rental, appropriate shoes, professional hairstyling, makeup that would photograph well under ballroom lighting, babysitter for the twins for what could be a very late evening. The total cost would stretch their already tight monthly budget to its absolute breaking point, but the potential return on investment could be enormous. One successful evening could lead to contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know what, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger and more determined with each word. We're going to do this properly. I'm going to walk into that ballroom looking like I absolutely belong there, because maybe for the first time in my professional life, I actually do belong there. Jake tugged on Sarah's sleeve, demanding attention. Mommy, will you tell us about the fancy party when you come home? I'll tell you everything, sweetie, every single detail. As Sarah looked at her family gathered around their small kitchen table, homework papers scattered between the remains of their simple dinner, she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. This was her moment, her opportunity to prove that a working mother from Queens could compete with Manhattan's elite, her chance to transform years of struggle and sacrifice into security and success. She had absolutely no idea that Derek Sterling had very different plans for her evening, and that her invitation was not a recognition of her potential, but the first move in a carefully orchestrated game of destruction. The morning of the gala arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in New York. Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the sapphire blue evening gown she had ultimately decided to purchase rather than rent. The decision had been financially painful, but as she told Mike, if this works out the way I hope, I'll need more formal dresses in my future. The reflection staring back at her was someone she barely recognized. Gone was the harried working mother in her usual uniform of blazers from discount stores and sensible flats. In her place stood a woman who looked like she belonged in boardrooms and ballrooms, someone who had earned her place among New York's power elite. Her phone buzzed insistently on the dresser, displaying a text from her business partner and best friend since college, Lisa Chen. Emergency, need to talk immediately before tonight. Derek Sterling's office called with contract modifications. Sarah's stomach dropped like she was in a fast elevator. She speed-dialed Lisa's number, pacing the narrow space between her bed and dresser, while Mike helped the twins get ready for their special day with Mrs. Rodriguez, their neighbor who had graciously agreed to extended babysitting duties. Lisa, what kind of modifications? Sarah asked without preamble, her voice tight with sudden anxiety. Major ones, and they're weird, Sarah. Really weird. The contract now includes exclusivity clauses that weren't there before, and some very specific attendance requirements for company events. But Sarah, there's something else that's bothering me even more. Well, what? Derek's assistant, Amanda Cross, she seemed to know way too much about your personal life during our call. She asked about Mike's work situation, about the twins' school. She even mentioned your apartment in Queens and asked if you were happy with your current living situation. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, raising goosebumps along her arms despite the warm morning. Why would Derek Sterling's assistant need to know anything about my family? That's exactly what I wondered. But she made it crystal clear that your presence at tonight's event was absolutely crucial for maintaining the Sterling contract. She used the phrase non-negotiable 3 separate times during our 15-minute conversation. Sarah sank onto her unmade bed. the beautiful evening gown suddenly feeling like a costume she was being forced to wear for someone else's play. Lisa, what if this isn't what we think it is? What if Derek didn't invite me because he values our work or sees potential in our partnership? What do you mean? What if he invited me because he wants something else entirely? Something that has nothing to do with marketing or business success? Before Lisa could respond, Sarah heard Mike's voice from the living room, sharp with confusion and concern. Sarah, there's a courier here with a delivery specifically for you. She found a uniformed delivery person holding an elegant black box emblazoned with Derek Sterling's company logo in gold foil. Inside, nestled in tissue paper like a precious artifact, was a stunning diamond necklace that caught the morning light and threw rainbows across their modest living room walls. The accompanying note was written in Derek's distinctive handwriting. For tonight, you'll need to look the part for what I have planned. Looking forward to seeing you soon. Derek. What? Mike read the note over her shoulder, his jaw tightening in a way Sarah recognized as his early warning system for serious displeasure. Sarah, this feels fundamentally wrong to me. Why is your client sending you jewelry that's probably worth more than our annual income? The necklace was indeed worth more than they made in 6 months. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she held it up to the natural light streaming through their living room window, watching the diamonds catch and refract the morning sun into thousands of tiny sparkles. I honestly don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the twins' chatter in the background. But we're in too deep now to back out. If I don't show up tonight wearing this necklace and playing whatever role Derek has in mind, we lose the Sterling contract. And if we lose that contract, we lose everything. She didn't need to spell out the mathematics of their situation. They both knew the numbers by heart. Without the Sterling account, Mitchell Marketing Solutions would fold within 90 days. Sarah would have to find another corporate position, probably for significantly less money than she was making as an entrepreneur. Mike would have to abandon his writing aspirations entirely and take whatever steady employment he could find, regardless of whether it utilized his skills or fed his soul. The twins ran into the room, excited about their special day with Mrs. Rodriguez, who had promised to take them to the park and let them help her bake cookies for her church's fundraiser. Mommy looks like a real princess, Jake announced, clapping his small hands together in delight. Emma studied the diamond necklace with the serious concentration she brought to everything that captured her interest. It's very pretty, Mommy, but it looks really heavy. Won't it hurt your neck? Sarah knelt down and gathered both children into a fierce hug, breathing in their familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence, trying to memorize this moment of simple family happiness before she walked into whatever Derek Sterling had orchestrated for the evening. I love you both more than all the stars in the sky, she said, fighting back unexpected tears. Always remember that, no matter what happens. We love you too, Mommy. Bring us back stories about all the fancy people and the big ballroom, Emma said, her small arms tight around Sarah's neck. As Sarah carefully fastened the diamond necklace around her throat, she caught Mike's deeply worried expression reflected in their hallway mirror. The weight of the diamonds felt less like jewelry and more like shackles, binding her to whatever game Derek Sterling intended to play with her life. She was walking willingly into his web, and some instinct deep in her gut told her she knew it. But with her family's financial future hanging precariously in the balance, and with dreams of security and success so close she could almost touch them, she felt she had no choice but to play his game by his rules. At least that's what she told herself as she kissed her children goodbye and headed toward what would become the most devastating night of her life. Derek Sterling stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office 60 floors above Manhattan, adjusting his platinum cufflinks with the precise movements of a man who had never known failure. At 42, he had built a $5 billion empire through a lethal combination of brilliant strategic thinking, absolute ruthlessness, and an almost supernatural ability to identify and exploit human weaknesses. Tonight would represent the culmination of 6 months of meticulous planning. His executive assistant, Amanda Cross, knocked softly before entering his office, her heels clicking against the Italian marble floors. At 28, Amanda embodied everything Derek found irresistible in his professional and personal relationships. She was strikingly beautiful, fiercely ambitious, completely devoted to his success, and willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain her position in his inner circle. She wore a stunning emerald silk dress that perfectly complemented her auburn hair and green eyes, chosen specifically for this evening's performance. Derek had selected the dress himself, just as he had orchestrated every other detail of the night's events. The car is ready, Derek. All the arrangements are in place exactly as you specified. Sim, Amanda paused, then added more quietly, are you absolutely certain about tonight's plan? Derek turned from the window, his expression shifting from contemplative to coldly calculated, the transformation as complete as flipping a switch. This was the face that had intimidated competitors, crushed rivals, and built an empire on the foundation of other people's fears and weaknesses. Amanda, do you trust my judgment? Of course I do, but Derek, Sarah Mitchell is married. She has two young children. This feels like we're crossing a line that we've never crossed before. This feels like business, Derek interrupted, his voice carrying the sharp edge that had made grown men tremble in boardrooms across 3 continents. Sarah Mitchell represents something I cannot and will not tolerate in my world. Do you know what that something is? Amanda shook her head, though she had learned over their 2 years of working together to recognize the dangerous glint that appeared in Derek's eyes when he was about to destroy someone who had dared to challenge him. Genuine authenticity, Derek said, pronouncing each word with disgust. She actually believes that hard work and integrity lead to success. She thinks the business world operates on merit and fairness. She has convinced herself that treating people decently is more important than maximizing profit margins. Tonight, I'm going to demonstrate to her and to everyone else in our industry exactly what naive idealism costs in the real world. The truth was more complex and more personal than Derek wanted to acknowledge, even to himself. 6 months earlier, he had attended the annual Marketing Excellence Conference, where Sarah had delivered the keynote presentation on ethical business practices in the digital age. Her passion and sincerity had irritated him in a way he initially couldn't explain or understand. Here was a woman who genuinely believed that success could be built on a foundation of integrity, that business leaders had moral obligations to their employees and communities, that competition could be fierce without being destructive. She had spoken about corporate responsibility with the kind of conviction that Derek had spent decades convincing himself was weakness disguised as virtue. Derek, what exactly are you planning to do to her? Amanda asked, though part of her already suspected she didn't want to know the complete answer. Derek moved to his massive desk and retrieved a thick manila folder, holding it with the reverence of a general reviewing battle plans. Sarah Mitchell's entire life is documented in here. Her struggling marriage, her financial pressures, her dreams for her children's futures, her business vulnerabilities, her personal insecurities. I have been systematically orchestrating her reality for months without her having the slightest idea that her life was being manipulated. He opened the folder with deliberate ceremony, revealing photographs, financial records, phone transcripts, even detailed psychological assessments prepared by a private investigation firm that specialized in corporate espionage. The major contract that saved her struggling business from bankruptcy. I arranged for her primary competitors to mysteriously lose their bids through a series of carefully timed complications. The personal recommendation that got her twins into that prestigious elementary school. I made a substantial anonymous donation to their scholarship fund. The apartment renovation loan they were miraculously approved for last month, despite their marginal credit rating. My private bank handled the approval at my specific request. Amanda felt physically sick as the scope of Derek's manipulation became clear. You've been controlling her entire life without her knowledge or consent? I've been positioning her exactly where I need her to be for maximum impact, Derek corrected with clinical precision. Tonight, Sarah Mitchell will learn that everything she believes she earned through hard work and moral behavior was actually given to her by me as part of an elaborate social experiment. And then I'm going to systematically take it all away, piece by piece, until she understands that integrity and idealism are luxuries that only the powerless can afford. Derek's plan was elegant in its calculated cruelty. He had invited Sarah to the gala knowing that she would witness him publicly appearing with Amanda as his date. The shock and humiliation would be the opening move in a chess game where Sarah didn't even know she was playing. Then would come the contract cancellation, the loan recalls, the school placement reversals, the systematic destruction of every aspect of the life she had built, while making it abundantly clear that he possessed the power to rebuild it all, but only if she agreed to play by his rules. But why her specifically? Amanda whispered, horrified by the scope of the plan. What did Sarah Mitchell do to deserve this level of destruction? Derek's expression softened slightly as he looked at Amanda, though the softness was more predatory than affectionate. She made the unforgivable mistake of making me feel ashamed of the methods I've used to build my empire. During her presentation, she talked about business leaders who prioritize short-term profits over long-term human welfare. She never mentioned my name directly, but everyone in that room knew exactly whose practices she was criticizing. The truth was more psychologically complex than Derek wanted to examine. Sarah's presentation had awakened something he had spent decades systematically burying: his conscience. For 45 minutes, listening to her passionate defense of ethical business practices, he had seen his empire for what it actually was. Not a testament to his brilliance and determination, but a monument to his willingness to destroy other people's lives in service of his own ambition and ego. That moment of unwelcome self-awareness had been unbearable. Rather than confront the possibility that his critics might be right, Derek had decided to prove that their moral positions were fundamentally naive and unsustainable. Derek, please reconsider this plan. We don't have to destroy this woman to prove your point. Derek walked over to Amanda, placing his hands on her shoulders with possessive gentleness. We absolutely have to do this, because tonight isn't just about Sarah Mitchell. It's about sending an unmistakable message to everyone in our industry and everyone who might consider challenging the natural order of corporate power. Idealism is dangerous. Authenticity is vulnerability. And anyone who suggests there's a better way to succeed than the way I've chosen will be systematically crushed as an example to others. As they prepared to leave for the gala, Derek experienced the familiar rush of absolute power that came from holding someone else's fate entirely in his hands. Sarah Mitchell had dared to suggest that his methods were morally questionable. Tonight, he would prove her wrong in the most devastating and public way imaginable. He had no way of knowing that Sarah Mitchell possessed reserves of strength and resilience that his psychological profile had failed to identify, and that his perfectly orchestrated plan would become the catalyst for his own spectacular downfall. The Grand Atoria Hotel's ballroom was a magnificent cathedral of wealth and corporate power. Its soaring ceilings draped in gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, the size of small automobiles, casting warm, flattering light over New York's financial and social elite. The air hummed with the sophisticated symphony of high-stakes conversations, stock tips worth millions, political maneuvering that would influence legislation, and discreet gossip that could topple careers or elevate unknowns to positions of influence. Sarah had never been in a room where casual conversations routinely involved figures with 8 or 9 zeros, where handshake agreements could reshape entire industries. Every person she passed radiated the confidence that came from knowing exactly where they belonged in the hierarchy of power and influence. She clutched her small evening purse tighter, acutely aware of the weight of Derek's diamond necklace against her throat. The jewelry felt less like an accessory and more like a collar marking her as his property. Every face she encountered seemed to assess her instantly: friend or foe, insider or outsider, predator or prey. Sarah Mitchell? A smooth, cultured voice called her name from behind. She turned to see Derek Sterling approaching through the crowd, devastatingly handsome in his custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. But he wasn't alone. On his arm, positioned with unmistakable intimacy, was a stunningly beautiful young woman with auburn hair that caught the ballroom lights like spun copper. The woman wore an emerald silk dress that hugged her figure perfectly and probably represented more money than Sarah spent on clothing in an entire year. But more than her beauty or her expensive attire, what struck Sarah immediately was the possessive way she touched Derek's arm and the proprietary way he smiled down at her. Derek, thank you so much for inviting me tonight. This is absolutely incredible, Sarah managed, forcing her professional smile while trying to ignore the obvious romantic chemistry crackling between Derek and his companion. I wouldn't dream of celebrating this milestone without my favorite marketing director here to witness it, Derek said, his voice carrying an undertone Sarah couldn't quite identify, but which made her instinctively uncomfortable. Sarah, I'd very much like you to meet Amanda Cross, my executive assistant and right hand in all my most important endeavors. Amanda extended her hand with practiced grace, her smile polite but unmistakably cold, like sunlight on winter ice. I've heard so much about you, Sarah. Derek talks about your work constantly, especially lately. Something in Amanda's tone, the subtle emphasis on the word work, the way she said Derek's first name with obvious familiarity, made Sarah's stomach twist with sudden understanding. This wasn't a professional relationship between boss and employee. This was something far more intimate and complicated. I hope the things he said have been positive, Sarah replied carefully, her marketing instincts kicking in despite her growing discomfort with the undercurrents she was sensing. Oh, extremely positive, Derek interjected, his eyes glittering with an emotion Sarah couldn't read, but which made her skin crawl. In fact, Amanda and I were just discussing some very exciting changes we're planning for our partnership with your firm. Changes that I think will surprise you. Before Sarah could ask what kind of changes he meant, a waiter materialized beside them, carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes filled with what was undoubtedly vintage Dom Perignon. Derek took 3 glasses with practiced ease, handing one each to Sarah and Amanda, before raising his own in what appeared to be a toast. To new beginnings and the end of old illusions, he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfied anticipation as he clinked his glass against both women's. As Sarah sipped the expensive champagne, bubbles fizzing against her tongue, she caught sight of a familiar figure pushing through the crowd toward their small group. Her heart stopped completely. Mike was walking directly toward them, his face a mask of confusion, rapidly transforming into something much darker and more dangerous. Mike, what are you doing here? Sarah's voice came out higher and more strained than she intended, panic beginning to rise in her chest like floodwater. Mrs. Rodriguez called me, Mike said, his eyes taking in Derek, Amanda, in the obviously intimate scene he had stumbled into. The twins were worried because you seemed really upset when you left tonight, and Jake started crying that something bad was going to happen to Mommy. I came to make sure you were okay, but clearly I was wrong to worry. His voice carried a bitter edge that Sarah had never heard before in their 8 years of marriage. Derek stepped forward with the fluid grace of a predator who had been anticipating exactly this moment. You must be Mike Mitchell. I'm Derek Sterling, and I have to say, I've been very much looking forward to meeting Sarah's husband. Mike ignored Derek's extended hand completely, his attention focused entirely on his wife with laser intensity. Sarah, I need to speak with you privately. Right now. Actually, Derek interjected smoothly, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to controlling every situation. I was hoping to discuss some urgent business matters with Sarah first. Amanda, would you mind showing Mike to the bar? I'm sure he could use a drink after his journey into Manhattan, and I'd hate for him to feel left out of our little business discussion. The dismissal was polite but absolute, delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that powerful men use to remind lesser people of their place in the hierarchy. Mike's face flushed dark red, but before he could respond, Amanda had smoothly taken his arm with professional efficiency. Of course, Derek. Mike, let me introduce you to some of our other guests. I'm sure you'll find the conversations fascinating, Amanda said, already guiding him away from Sarah with the skill of someone who had clearly performed this exact maneuver many times before. Sarah watched helplessly as her husband was led away, like a child being managed by adults, panic rising in her throat as she realized how completely she had lost control of the situation. Derek, I really should go with my husband. Sarah. Derek's voice had changed completely, transformed from charming businessman to something cold and calculating and absolutely terrifying. Do you remember a marketing conference about 6 months ago? You delivered a keynote presentation about ethical business practices in the modern corporate environment. Sarah nodded, completely confused by the sudden change of subject and the dangerous edge in Derek's voice. You talked passionately about business leaders who prioritize profit over people, who treat employees and competitors as disposable assets rather than human beings. You suggested that true success comes from lifting others up rather than stepping on them to climb higher. Do you remember saying those things? Yes, but I don't understand what this has to do with... It has everything to do with everything, Derek interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. Because sitting in that audience, listening to your self-righteous little lecture, I realized that you were talking about me. Not by name, of course. You're far too polite and politically correct for that kind of direct confrontation, But everyone in that room knew exactly whose business practices you were condemning. Sarah's blood ran cold as understanding began to dawn, horrible and inevitable like sunrise after the worst night of your life. Derek, you never meant to challenge me directly, Derek agreed, moving closer until she could smell his expensive cologne and see the cold calculation in his eyes. But you did something far worse than direct confrontation. You made me feel ashamed of the empire I've built through superior strategy and absolute determination. You made me question methods that have generated billions of dollars in value and created thousands of jobs. That, Sarah, was your first critical mistake. Derek moved even closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear while the party continued around them, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. Your second mistake was believing that your recent success was earned through hard work and ethical behavior, rather than given to you as part of an elaborate experiment. The major contract that saved your business from bankruptcy? I manipulated the bidding process to ensure you would win. Your children's placement in that prestigious school? I made a substantial anonymous donation. Your apartment renovation loan approval, despite your marginal credit rating? My bank processed it at my personal request. Sarah felt the ballroom spinning around her, the champagne turning to acid in her stomach. That's not possible. We earned those opportunities through the quality of our work. You earn nothing, Derek said with surgical precision, each word chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage. Everything you think you've achieved through moral superiority and hard work was actually handed to you by me as part of a controlled social experiment. And now I'm going to systematically take it all away, piece by piece, until you understand that idealism and integrity are luxuries that only the powerless can afford. Across the crowded ballroom, Sarah could see Mike standing near the bar with Amanda, his body language radiating confusion and growing anger, as Amanda whispered something in his ear that made his expression darken with suspicion and hurt. Why? Sarah whispered, the single word carrying all her horror and disbelief and desperate hope that this was some kind of misunderstanding that could still be resolved. Derek smiled, and for the first time that evening, the expression reached his eyes, transforming his handsome features into something genuinely terrifying. Because you needed to learn that in the real world, there are only two categories of human beings, those who possess power and those who serve those who possess power. Tonight, you're going to discover definitively which category you belong to. As if choreographed by some malevolent director, the room's attention began turning toward the stage where Derek's promotion ceremony was about to begin. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the crowd, the diamond necklace feeling like it was strangling her, while her entire world crumbled around her with methodical precision. The worst part was the growing realization that this was only the beginning of Derek's plan, and she had no idea how much deeper his cruelty could go. The master of ceremonies, a distinguished man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to introducing powerful people, called for the room's attention as Derek made his way toward the elevated stage. Sarah stood abandoned in the middle of the crowd like a chess piece left behind after a devastating gambit, her hands shaking as she gripped her champagne flute. Derek's words echoed in her mind with the persistence of a nightmare. Everything you think you've achieved was actually handed to you by me. The implications were staggering, reshaping not just her understanding of recent events, but her entire sense of self-worth and professional competence. She desperately searched the room for Mike, finally spotting him near the bar with Amanda. Even from this distance, Sarah could see the rigid tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward her with an expression that mixed confusion, suspicion, and what looked disturbingly like betrayal. Amanda stood close beside him, her lips near his ear, clearly sharing information that was causing Mike's face to darken with each whispered word. Ladies and gentlemen, Derek's voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom through the sophisticated sound system. Thank you for joining me on this extraordinary evening. As I accept the position of chairman of Sterling Industries, I want to take a moment to thank the people who have made this achievement possible. Sarah felt hundreds of pairs of eyes briefly touch her as Derek paused deliberately, his gaze sweeping the crowd until it found her face. The diamond necklace seemed to burn against her skin, marking her as his possession in front of everyone who mattered in their industry. Success in business requires making difficult decisions, Derek continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture to particularly naive students. Sometimes we must separate emotion from strategy. Sometimes we must choose between what feels comfortable and what delivers measurable results. Sometimes we must confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the way power actually operates in the real world. A murmur of approval rippled through the audience. These were people who understood the ruthless mathematics of corporate success, who had built their own fortunes by making hard choices that prioritize results over sentiment. Tonight, I want to share with you a story about the dangerous seduction of misplaced idealism in modern business, Derek said, his voice carrying a note of paternal disappointment that made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. 6 months ago, I attended a conference where a speaker delivered a passionate presentation about ethical business practices. It was a beautiful sentiment, delivered with genuine conviction and obvious sincerity. Sarah's chest tightened as she realized with crystal clarity where this performance was heading. She wanted to run, to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare, but she was trapped by the crowd and the spotlight of Derek's attention. The speaker was Sarah Mitchell of Mitchell Marketing Solutions, who is here with us tonight as our honored guest. A spotlight operator, clearly briefed in advance, swept a brilliant beam of light across the crowd until it found Sarah, illuminating her like a specimen pinned to a display board. Polite applause scattered through the room, but Sarah could feel the shift in energy, the way Derek's tone had already informed the audience that this wasn't going to be a celebration. Sarah's presentation was genuinely inspiring, Derek continued, his voice building momentum, like a prosecutor preparing to deliver a closing argument. But it got me thinking about the fundamental gap between idealistic theory and business reality. So I decided to conduct a small experiment in applied psychology. The room was buzzing now with anticipation and curiosity. This was clearly significant news being delivered with Derek's trademark theatrical flair, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be discussed and analyzed for months to come. Richard felt her legs growing weak, but the spotlight held her captive while Derek systematically prepared to destroy her in front of her professional peers. For the past 6 months, Derek announced, his voice rising to fill every corner of the ballroom, my company has been Sarah Mitchell's largest and most important client. We have provided her firm with business opportunities worth over $2 million in revenue. Sarah believes she earned this success through the exceptional quality of her work and the strength of her ethical principles. Derek paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build while Sarah stood frozen in the merciless spotlight. But here's what Sarah didn't know, and what I want all of you to understand about the difference between idealistic thinking and strategic reality. Every contract, every referral, every opportunity that came to her firm over the past 6 months was orchestrated by me as part of a controlled social experiment. I wanted to test whether good intentions and moral principles could compete with strategic manipulation and carefully applied leverage. The room had fallen completely silent now, the only sound Sarah could hear being her own heartbeat pounding in her ears like a drum. Sarah's work has been competent but unremarkable, Derek continued with clinical precision. What made her successful wasn't her ethics or her talent or her commitment to treating people fairly. What made her successful was my decision to make her successful as part of testing whether idealistic business models could survive in a competitive environment. Derek smiled with the satisfaction of a chess master delivering checkmate. Tonight, that experiment ends with definitive results. The spotlight seemed to grow brighter and hotter, but Derek wasn't finished with his public vivisection. Effective immediately, Sterling Industries is terminating all contracts and business relationships with Mitchell Marketing Solutions. We have determined that companies built on idealistic foundations lack the pragmatic flexibility and strategic thinking required for serious business partnerships in today's competitive marketplace. The spotlight finally released Sarah, but the damage was complete and irreversible. She stood in the crowd, professionally executed in front of everyone who could ever hire her again, while whispers spread through the room like wildfire. She actually thought she earned those contracts through merit. $2 million in business, just gone because she annoyed the wrong person. Derek Sterling never does anything without a calculated reason. That's what happens when you lecture people about ethics without understanding how business really works. Sarah's phone buzzed insistently with a text from Lisa. Emergency. 3 clients calling about terminating contracts. News is spreading online already. What the hell happened at that party? Before Sarah could even begin to formulate a response, she saw Mike pushing aggressively through the crowd toward her, his face a mask of fury and confusion, and something that looked terrifyingly like disgust. Sarah, what the hell is going on here? He demanded when he reached her, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustic dead zone that had formed around her. That woman Amanda just showed me photographs of you and Derek together. Business dinners at romantic restaurants, private meetings in his office, situations where you're clearly playing some kind of intimate game that you never bothered to mention to your husband. Mike, no, it's not what you think. Then explain this, Mike said, pulling out his phone to show her a photograph Amanda had obviously shared with him. The image showed Sarah and Derek at an upscale restaurant, leaning close together over documents, Derek's hand resting on her forearm in a gesture that looked unmistakably intimate to anyone who didn't know the context. Sarah stared at the photo, remembering that particular dinner with horrible clarity. Derek had insisted they meet to discuss contract details, choosing an intimate restaurant and ordering expensive wine while positioning himself closer than was professionally appropriate throughout the meal. She had been uncomfortable but had tolerated his behavior because she thought it was the price of doing business with demanding clients. Now she realized it had all been orchestrated and documented, every uncomfortable moment photographed as ammunition for this exact confrontation. Mike, he set this up. All of it. He's been manipulating everything about our lives for months. Stop, Mike said, his voice breaking with pain and anger. Just stop lying to me, Sarah. You knew what he was doing, didn't you? You played along with his games because you thought it would advance your career, and you didn't care what it cost our marriage or our family's reputation. That's not true. You're wearing his jewelry, Sarah, Mike said, gesturing at the diamond necklace that felt like it was choking her. You came to his party as his guest while he publicly humiliated and destroyed you, and you're still wearing his diamonds like some kind of trophy. What exactly am I supposed to think about that? Sarah reached desperately for the necklace clasp, her fingers shaking too badly to work the mechanism, while tears began streaming down her carefully made-up face. I can't do this anymore, Mike said, stepping backward as if her presence was contaminating. I can't watch you destroy yourself and our family for someone who just proved he sees you as nothing more than entertainment for his rich friends. Mike, please, let me explain what really happened. But her husband was already walking away, pushing through the crowd toward the exit while conversations resumed around them, and the party continued as if nothing had happened. Sarah started to follow him, but Amanda appeared beside her like a shadow, blocking her path with seemingly casual positioning. I wouldn't chase after him if I were you, Amanda said quietly, her voice carrying a note of what might have been genuine sympathy. It will only make you look more desperate than you already do. Sarah turned on Amanda, her grief and shock transforming into pure rage. You did this. You showed him those photographs, didn't you? You poisoned my husband against me as part of Derek's sick game. I showed him documentation of your relationship with Derek, Amanda replied, though her voice lacked the conviction she was clearly trying to project. Derek gave me very specific instructions about how to handle your husband's presence here tonight. And you followed those instructions? Even knowing what it would do to my marriage and my family? For the first time that evening, Amanda's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing something that looked like guilt or regret. You don't understand what Derek Sterling is capable of when people disappoint him. I didn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Sarah said, the words emerging with more strength than she felt. You chose to help him destroy my marriage because you thought it would benefit you professionally and personally. Amanda's expression hardened again, the moment of vulnerability disappearing behind her professional mask. You're absolutely right. I did make that choice. Because in Derek's world, you're either with him or you're collateral damage. I chose to be with him rather than become another one of his cautionary tales. As Amanda walked away, Sarah stood alone in the ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of people who had just witnessed her professional and personal destruction. The gala continued around her, but she had become invisible, irrelevant, a non-entity whose dramatic downfall was already being forgotten in favor of more interesting conversations. Derek's experiment was complete, and she had been the unwilling subject whose destruction had proven his thesis about the futility of idealistic thinking in a world governed by power and manipulation. But as Sarah finally managed to unclasp the diamond necklace and let it fall to the ballroom floor with a small but satisfying crash, she realized something that Derek hadn't anticipated in his careful psychological calculations. She was still standing, destroyed, humiliated, financially ruined, and abandoned by her husband, but still fundamentally herself. And that, she was beginning to understand, might be more dangerous to Derek Sterling than he had calculated. Sarah arrived at her apartment at 2 in the morning to find the front door unlocked and Mike's belongings scattered across their bedroom like debris after a tornado. The twins were still sleeping peacefully at Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment next door, mercifully unaware that their parents' world was disintegrating in real time. "Mike?" she called softly, not wanting to wake their neighbors or alert the children to the crisis unfolding in their home. She found him in their cramped home office, methodically stuffing his laptop, files, and personal documents into a large duffel bag with the mechanical precision of someone operating purely on emotional autopilot. "The kids don't need to witness this," he said without looking at her, his voice flat and emotionally exhausted. "I'll stay at my brother Tom's place in Brooklyn until we figure out what comes next. If anything comes next." Sarah leaned heavily against the doorframe, still wearing the sapphire evening gown that now felt like a costume from someone else's nightmare. The beautiful dress that had represented hope and possibility 12 hours earlier now felt like evidence of her naive stupidity. "Mike, please give me a chance to explain what really happened tonight. What's been happening for months without either of us realizing it?" "I know exactly what happened," Mike replied, his voice carrying the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from having your fundamental assumptions about reality shattered in a single evening. "You got seduced by the possibility of success and power, and you lost sight of what actually matters. Derek Sterling played you like a violin, and you let him because you thought you were smart enough to handle his manipulation without getting burned. That's not fair, and you know it." "Fair?" Mike stopped packing and finally looked directly at her, his eyes red-rimmed with fatigue and pain. "Sarah, you wore another man's jewelry to his party while he publicly executed your professional reputation. And you're talking to me about fairness? Do you have any idea how it felt for me to watch that performance, knowing that you had been lying to me about the nature of your relationship with him?" Sarah sank into the desk chair she used for late-night client calls and emergency project deadlines, feeling the fight drain out of her as the full scope of Derek's manipulation became clear. "He planned every detail of this, Mike. For 6 months, he's been systematically orchestrating our lives, manipulating our opportunities, controlling our choices without us even knowing we were being controlled." Mike's expression softened slightly, but the hurt and betrayal in his eyes remained unchanged. "Then why didn't you tell me you were uncomfortable with his behavior? Why didn't you ask for help when you realized something wasn't right?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow because she knew the answer, and it wasn't flattering to her character or her marriage. She had enjoyed feeling important and valued by someone with Derek's level of power and influence. She had told herself she was protecting Mike from worry about their financial situation, but the truth was far more complicated and shameful. "I thought I could handle him," she admitted quietly. "I thought I was smart enough and strong enough to take his business without getting caught in his psychological games. I was arrogant enough to believe I could outsmart a predator. And now? Now I realize that I was just another mark in whatever twisted social experiment he was conducting. Another data point in his research about human weakness and the price of idealistic thinking." "Show." Mike resumed packing, his movements slower and more deliberate now, as if the conversation had drained some of his anger and left behind pure sadness. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with notifications, emails from clients asking about Derek's public announcement, LinkedIn messages from professional contacts expressing concern or distancing themselves from her firm, text messages from colleagues who had seen video of the gala already circulating on social media. She opened her laptop and watched her professional reputation disintegrate in real time. A video of Derek's speech was trending on multiple platforms, accompanied by commentary from industry leaders, about the dangers of mixing personal ideology with business strategy. The narrative being constructed painted her as a naive idealist who had tried to lecture successful people about ethics without understanding how business actually worked. "Look at this," Sarah said, turning her laptop screen toward Mike. "He didn't just destroy our contracts and our income. He systematically destroyed my professional credibility. No one in marketing will hire me after this character assassination." Mike read several of the comments, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the scope of Derek's retaliation. "This is deliberate and coordinated character destruction. He's not just punishing you for challenging him, he's making you an example to intimidate anyone else who might consider criticizing his methods." "It gets significantly worse," Sarah continued, scrolling through her email inbox with growing horror. "Three of our other major clients have terminated their contracts effective immediately, citing concerns about our firm's stability and judgment. Lisa is fielding calls from creditors and suppliers, asking about our ability to meet our financial obligations." The mathematical implications hit them both simultaneously with crushing clarity. Without the sterling contract and facing multiple client cancellations, Mitchell Marketing Solutions couldn't survive 30 days. They would have to declare bankruptcy, liquidate their office equipment, and lay off their two part-time employees who depended on those paychecks to support their own families. "What about the apartment renovation loan?" Mike asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Sarah dialed their bank's customer service line, navigating through multiple automated menu systems until she reached a human representative who could access their account information. "I'm calling to check on the status of our home improvement loan," she said, providing their account number and personal identification information. After a long hold period filled with cheerful elevator music, the representative returned with devastating news delivered in the carefully neutral tone that financial institutions use for life-altering communications. "Mrs. Mitchell, I show that your loan was approved under our special community investment program, which is being discontinued due to regulatory changes. The bank is exercising its contractual right to call the full loan amount within 30 days of notification." Sarah hung up the phone and stared at Mike with the expression of someone watching their house burn down. "They want $47,000 in 30 days, or they begin foreclosure proceedings." The apartment they had been so excited to renovate, the home where they had planned to raise their children and build their family's future, was about to be taken away as part of Derek's systematic destruction of their lives. Mike sat heavily on their bed, his head in his hands in a gesture of complete defeat. "Sarah, how are we going to explain to Emma and Jake that we're losing everything we've worked for? How do we tell two 6-year-olds that mommy made some bad decisions that are going to cost our family their home and their security?" Before Sarah could attempt to formulate an answer to an impossible question, her phone rang with Derek Sterling's personal number displayed on the caller ID. "Don't answer it," Mike said immediately, his voice sharp with alarm. "Whatever he's calling about, it's not to apologize or help us. He's calling to twist the knife deeper." "I have to answer," Sarah said desperately, hope and desperation overriding her better judgment. "Maybe I can reason with him, find some way to negotiate a solution that doesn't destroy our children's lives." But Sarah was already accepting the call, driven by maternal panic and the desperate hope that she could somehow bargain her way out of the trap Derek had constructed around her family. "Hello, Sarah." Derek's voice was warm and almost paternal, carrying no trace of the cold calculation he had displayed at the gala. "I hope you're not too upset about tonight's events. Business is business, after all, and I trust you understand that my actions weren't personal." "Derek, please," Sarah said, her voice breaking with desperation. "I have two small children who had nothing to do with any conflict between us. Whatever point you were trying to make with tonight's performance, you've made it successfully. Can we please discuss some kind of arrangement that protects my family?" Derek's laugh was genuinely amused, the sound of someone enjoying a particularly clever joke. "An arrangement? Oh, Sarah, you still don't understand the fundamental dynamics of our relationship. This isn't a negotiation between equals. This is a lesson in the consequences of challenging people who possess real power." Sarah gripped the phone tighter, hope flickering despite everything that had happened. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I'm not entirely without compassion for your situation," Derek replied, his voice taking on the tone of a benevolent authority figure, considering mercy for a defeated opponent. I might be willing to reverse some of tonight's decisions, reinstate your contracts, provide assistance with your immediate financial difficulties, perhaps even help rehabilitate your professional reputation. But first, you need to demonstrate that you've learned from this experience and understand the new parameters of our relationship. Mike was shaking his head frantically, making slashing gestures across his throat to indicate she should hang up immediately. But Sarah couldn't stop herself from asking the question that would seal her fate. What would that demonstration involve? Meet me tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock, alone. We'll discuss the terms and conditions of your professional and personal rehabilitation in detail. The word rehabilitation made Sarah's skin crawl with its implications of systematic re-education and control, but the alternative was watching her family lose everything they had worked to build over 8 years of marriage. I'll consider it, she said carefully, trying to maintain some semblance of negotiating position. Don't consider for too long, Derek replied, his voice hardening slightly. Offers like this have a very short shelf life, and the consequences of rejection tend to compound rapidly. Good night, Sarah. Sweet dreams. After Derek ended the call, Sarah sat staring at her phone while Mike finished packing in silence, heavy with disappointment and fear. You're actually thinking about meeting with him tomorrow, aren't you? Mike said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and resignation. Sarah looked at her husband, seeing the disappointment and terror in his eyes, and realized with horrible clarity that Derek's systematic destruction of her life was just beginning. The public humiliation at the gala had been merely the opening move in a much longer and more sophisticated game of psychological chess, and she was starting to understand that she had no choice but to play by his rules if she wanted to protect the people she loved most in the world. Sarah spent the longest night of her life pacing their empty apartment, alternately calculating their financial position and staring at her phone, which continued buzzing with increasingly desperate messages from clients, creditors, and colleagues. Every mathematical scenario ended in bankruptcy and homelessness. Every potential solution required resources or connections they didn't possess. When morning finally arrived, bringing no relief or clarity, Sarah called Derek's office and agreed to meet him at the location he specified, Le Bernardin, one of Manhattan's most exclusive and expensive restaurants, where privacy was guaranteed and powerful people conducted business that changed lives and industries. Derek was already seated at a corner table when Sarah arrived, looking refreshed and predatory in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He had chosen the restaurant carefully, she realized, a place where the staff were trained to be invisible and discreet, where conversations couldn't be overheard or recorded, where the opulent surroundings would remind her constantly of the vast gulf between his power and her desperation. Sarah, you look tired, he said as she sat across from him, his voice carrying the false concern of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. I hope last night wasn't too emotionally difficult for you. Cut the fake sympathy, Derek. What exactly do you want from me? Derek smiled, clearly appreciating her attempt at directness, even while knowing it was a performance born of desperation rather than strength. I want you to understand your current position with absolute clarity. You are approximately 48 hours away from complete financial collapse. Your business is finished, your marriage appears to be failing, and your children's futures are in serious jeopardy. But I possess the power to fix all of those problems with a few strategic phone calls. In exchange for what, specifically? Derek leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to the intimate whisper that powerful men used when they were about to make offers that would fundamentally alter someone's life trajectory. I want you to work for me, not as an independent contractor or external vendor, but as a direct employee of Sterling Industries. You'll join my company as a senior marketing director, reporting directly to me and serving as living proof that redemption is possible for those who learn to embrace reality instead of fighting it. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as the implications became clear. Why would you want to hire someone whose reputation you just systematically destroyed? Because destruction and reconstruction are both tools of control, Derek replied with the casual tone of someone discussing weather patterns. Right now, you're a cautionary tale about the dangers of idealistic thinking in competitive business environments. But if I hire you back at a significantly higher salary than you've ever earned, you become something even more valuable. living proof that forgiveness and opportunity are available to those who demonstrate they've learned from their mistakes. Derek retrieved an elegant leather portfolio from beside his chair, removing a thick legal document and placing it on the table between them with the reverence of a general presenting surrender terms. 5-year employment agreement, non-negotiable and binding, he announced. Annual salary of $350,000 plus performance bonuses that could add another $100,000 per year. Your student loans paid off completely within 90 days. Your apartment renovation loan forgiven and removed from your credit history. Your children's college education funds fully established and protected in trust accounts. Sarah stared at the contract, the numbers swimming before her eyes like a mirage in the desert. It represented more money than she had ever imagined earning, enough to secure her family's financial future permanently and provide opportunities for Emma and Jake that she had never dared to dream about. What does the phrase personal loyalty mean in this context? She asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would be more horrifying than she wanted to acknowledge. Derek's smile turned genuinely predatory, revealing the calculating intelligence that had built his empire through the systematic destruction of anyone who dared to challenge his authority. Personal loyalty means you acknowledge that your previous independence was an illusion based on my tolerance rather than your competence. It means you accept that your future success depends entirely on my continued approval and support. It means you become a living testament to my power and wisdom rather than a challenge to my methods. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Mike. Kids keep asking when you're coming to get them. Mrs. Rodriguez can't keep them much longer. They're scared and confused. The weight of her children's needs and fears pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Emma and Jake had no understanding of corporate power games or philosophical conflicts between idealism and pragmatism. They just needed their parents to provide stability, security, and the promise that tomorrow would be better than today. I need concrete guarantees, Sarah said, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's subdued background noise. If I sign this contract, my family must be completely protected, regardless of what happens between us professionally or personally. Of course, Derek agreed with the smooth confidence of someone who had anticipated every possible objection. Your children's welfare is absolutely paramount to me. In fact, I've taken the liberty of researching the finest private schools in Manhattan. Emma and Jake could begin classes at the Riverside Academy next fall, receiving the kind of education that opens doors to Ivy League universities and unlimited opportunities. He produced another document from his portfolio, this one detailing educational opportunities that would cost more than Sarah's previous annual income and provide advantages she had never imagined being able to offer her children. Derek, Sarah said, fighting to maintain some semblance of control over the negotiation. Why is my submission so important to you? You could destroy 100 people like me without breaking a sweat or damaging your reputation. What makes my particular surrender so valuable? Derek's expression grew thoughtful and almost philosophical, as if he were considering a question of genuine intellectual interest, rather than discussing the terms of someone's psychological capitulation. Do you know what I realized while listening to your presentation 6 months ago? He asked. You actually believe that good people deserve good outcomes. You think the universe operates according to some kind of moral balance that rewards virtue and punishes vice. You have convinced yourself that ethical behavior and hard work will ultimately triumph over strategic manipulation and raw power. He paused to take a deliberate sip of his wine, a vintage that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. I built a $5 billion empire by understanding that the universe is morally neutral, Derek continued. Good things happen to people who possess power and know how to use it strategically. Bad things happen to people who lack power and cling to naive beliefs about fairness and justice. Your presentation suggested that I was fundamentally wrong about human nature and business success. Tonight's offer proves that your idealistic worldview leads to destruction, while my pragmatic approach leads to salvation. Sarah felt physically sick as she understood the complete scope of his psychological manipulation, but she also grasped the terrible logic of his proposition with crystal clarity. You want me to be your trophy, she said, living proof that even the most idealistic people will abandon their principles when the stakes become high enough. I want you to be realistic about how power actually operates in the modern world, Derek corrected. You have two choices and only two choices. Sign this contract and secure your family's future permanently, or maintain your philosophical purity while watching your children suffer the consequences of your stubborn refusal to accept reality. Before Sarah could formulate a response, Derek's phone chimed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and smiled with satisfaction. Perfect timing, he said, answering the phone and immediately activating the speaker function. Amanda, you're connected with Sarah Mitchell. Please provide your report. Derek, I've completed the calls to marketing firms throughout the city like you requested. Amanda's voice carried clearly across the table. Professionally neutral, but tinged with something that might have been guilt or regret. I've shared the video documentation from last night's event and provided additional context about Sarah's unprofessional conduct during your business relationship. Sarah's blood ran cold with the realization that Derek's destruction of her reputation was still actively continuing. What additional context? She managed to ask. I may have mentioned that you made several inappropriate romantic advances toward Derek during business meetings. Amanda replied, her voice carefully modulated to sound reluctant rather than malicious. And that your husband's dramatic appearance at the gala suggested you had been using your marriage as cover for an extramarital affair with a client. None of that is true, Sarah said desperately. Amanda, you know that's completely fabricated. Truth is subjective in our industry, Derek interjected calmly, ending the call with casual indifference. What matters is perception and narrative construction, and the current perception is that you're professionally unreliable, personally compromised, and fundamentally untrustworthy as a business partner. Derek leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a chess master who had just delivered an inevitable checkmate. By close of business today, every major marketing firm in New York will have heard that story. Your chances of finding employment elsewhere in your field have just dropped to absolute zero. Sarah stared at the contract in front of her, understanding with horrible clarity that Derek had just systematically eliminated every alternative except complete submission. She could sign his document and become his psychological captive, or she could maintain her integrity while watching her family descend into poverty and her reputation ensure she could never climb back up. I need time to think about this decision, she said, though they both knew she was simply delaying the inevitable. You have until 5 o'clock this afternoon, Derek replied, checking his expensive watch with theatrical precision. After that deadline, this offer expires permanently, and you'll discover exactly how much power I possess to make your life systematically more difficult. As Sarah walked out of the restaurant into the bright afternoon sunlight that felt harsh and unforgiving after the restaurant's dim intimacy, she realized that Derek's game was far more psychologically sophisticated than simple revenge or professional retaliation. He was systematically removing every option except surrender, and he was doing it in a way designed to make her feel grateful for her own defeat and destruction. The most terrifying part was recognizing that his strategy was working exactly as he had planned. Sarah sat in her car outside the restaurant, staring at Derek's contract while her phone continued exploding with increasingly frantic messages. Lisa had sent a series of texts about creditors demanding immediate payment and clients fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. Mike had forwarded a news article that portrayed Sarah as an unstable woman who had tried to manipulate her way into New York's business elite through inappropriate relationships with powerful men. The character assassination was masterfully orchestrated, painting her as a calculating social climber who had used her marriage as cover while pursuing Derek romantically for professional advancement. According to these unnamed but authoritative sources, her appearance at the gala had been a desperate final gambit to secure Derek's continued patronage after he had ended their inappropriate relationship. Sarah's hands shook as she read the articles, each one more damaging than the last. Her professional reputation wasn't just destroyed, it was being systematically poisoned to ensure she could never recover or rebuild in any industry or location. Her phone rang, displaying a name she hadn't seen in over 2 years. Jenny Rodriguez, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Her college roommate and former best friend before careers in geography had pulled their lives in different directions. Sarah, I just saw the news articles and social media coverage. Are you okay? What the hell happened? Jenny, Sarah's voice broke with relief at hearing a friendly voice. I'm drowning. Derek Sterling has been systematically destroying my life for months, and I don't know how to fight back against someone with his resources and connections. Listen to me very carefully, Jenny said, her voice immediately shifting into the professional tone Sarah remembered from their law enforcement career discussions in college. Can you talk freely right now? Are you somewhere safe where you can't be overheard? I'm sitting in my car outside a restaurant where Derek just offered me a job in exchange for my complete psychological submission to his authority. Jenny was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Sarah, how much do you know about Derek Sterling's business practices beyond what he's done to you personally? What do you mean? I mean that Derek Sterling has been on the FBI's radar for the past 18 months as part of a larger investigation into corporate pension, fund fraud, and illegal market manipulation practices. The problem is that he's extremely sophisticated at insulating himself from direct legal culpability. Sarah felt the first flicker of hope she had experienced in 24 hours, though it was mixed with terror at the implications of what Jenny was suggesting. Are you saying he's actually committed prosecutable crimes? I'm saying that someone in Derek's position doesn't accumulate $5 billion in assets without breaking numerous federal regulations and possibly several criminal statutes. But we need someone with inside access to his operations to build a case that will survive his legal team's challenges. Jenny's implication was clear, but Sarah's immediate response was overwhelming fear rather than determination or hope for justice. Jenny, I can't do what you're suggesting. He's already destroyed my business and my marriage. If I cross him again by cooperating with a federal investigation, he'll come after my children directly. Sarah, listen to me. Derek Sterling operates by making potential threats feel isolated and powerless. But you're not powerless, and you're definitely not alone. What if I told you that you're not the first person he's targeted for this kind of systematic psychological destruction? Jenny went on to explain that Derek had a well-documented pattern of identifying potential challenges to his authority and neutralizing them through comprehensive campaigns of professional and personal destruction. Business rivals driven to bankruptcy and suicide, journalists who had been discredited and blacklisted from their industry, former employees who had been systematically destroyed for questioning company policies. The difference with your situation, Jenny continued, is that Derek made this personal and public. He usually delegates this kind of destruction to his subordinates and maintains plausible deniability. But something about your conference presentation really got under his skin, so he took direct control of your destruction. Sarah remembered Derek's words from the previous evening. You made me feel ashamed of the empire I've built. Jenny, even if everything you're saying is accurate, I don't have access to evidence of criminal activity. All I can prove is that he's a sociopathic narcissist who enjoys destroying people, which isn't actually illegal. That's where you're wrong, Jenny replied. The employment contract he just offered you, that's potential evidence of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice, especially if he's trying to control your testimony to prevent you from cooperating with a federal investigation. But there is no active federal investigation that involves me. There is now. Sarah, I'm officially requesting your cooperation as a witness in a federal investigation of Sterling Industries and Derek Sterling personally. Your experiences aren't just personal grievances. They're evidence of a systematic pattern of criminal behavior designed to obstruct justice and intimidate potential witnesses. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again, but this time in a direction that offered possibilities beyond mere survival. What would I have to do specifically? First, absolutely do not sign that employment contract. Second, document every interaction you've had with Derek, especially anything involving Amanda Cross or other Sterling Industries employees. Third, be prepared to wear a recording device if we can arrange another meeting where Derek might incriminate himself. Sarah's phone began ringing with Derek Sterling's personal number, interrupting her conversation with Jenny. He's calling me right now, Sarah said, panic rising in her voice. Don't answer it. Let it go to voicemail. From this point forward, every communication with Derek needs to be documented and controlled by our investigation team. But Sarah was already accepting the call, her maternal instincts overriding her newfound hope for justice and accountability. Hello, Derek. Sarah, you've had 4 hours to consider my extremely generous offer. Derek's voice had shifted from paternal warmth to something much colder and more threatening. I trust you've made the intelligent decision for your family's welfare. I need more time to consider all the implications. Time is up, Derek interrupted, his voice turning glacially cold. Since you seem to require additional motivation to make the obvious choice, I've arranged a small demonstration of what rejection costs in the real world. Derek's next words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to maximize psychological damage. Effective immediately, your bank is initiating foreclosure proceedings on your apartment. Your children's school has been notified that their tuition payments have been suspended, so they'll need to withdraw by Friday. Oh, and I've had a very productive conversation with Child Protective Services about the instability and neglect in your home environment. Sarah's vision blurred with panic as the scope of Derek's power became terrifyingly clear. Derek, please, not my children. They're innocent in whatever conflict exists between us. Your children's welfare depends entirely on your decision in the next 60 seconds. Derek replied with absolute coldness. Sign my employment contract and they'll be protected, educated, and provided for at the highest levels. Refuse my offer, and they'll learn what it means to have a mother who chose stubborn pride over practical responsibility. Jenny was making frantic gestures, mouthing the words, hang up, but Sarah was drowning in maternal terror and desperation. Where do I sign? She whispered, defeat evident in every syllable. My office, 6 o'clock sharp. Come alone, dress appropriately for your new corporate position, and be prepared to begin work immediately. Your rehabilitation starts tonight. After Derek ended the call, Sarah sat in stunned silence while Jenny tried desperately to get her attention and explained that Derek's threats were largely bluffs designed to manipulate her through fear. Sarah, listen to me. He can't actually take your children. Child Protective Services doesn't work that way, and schools can't simply expel students without due process. He's using your fear against you. What if he's not bluffing? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. What if he really does have the connections and power to destroy my children's lives? Jenny's voice was gentle but urgent. Then we make absolutely certain he loses that power permanently. But first, you have to stop operating from fear and start getting angry. As Sarah drove toward Derek Sterling's office to surrender her freedom in exchange for her children's security, she realized that Jenny was right about one crucial thing. She had been operating from fear instead of anger. But anger, she was beginning to understand, might be exactly what she needed to survive what was coming next. Sarah sat in Derek's opulent office, the signed employment contract between them, like a treaty written in her own blood. Derek had been magnanimous in victory, offering expensive coffee and speaking about her new role with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted the outcome of any negotiation. You'll be working closely with Amanda to rehabilitate your professional image and craft a narrative about your temporary lapse in judgment, Derek explained, settling behind his massive desk like a king on his throne. We'll position your previous criticisms of aggressive business practices as the naive idealism of someone who hadn't yet learned how real success is achieved in competitive markets. Amanda sat across from them in an elegant chair, her face carefully neutral, but Sarah caught something unexpected in her eyes. What looked like guilt mixed with recognition of her own trapped position in Derek's web of control and manipulation. Your first assignment, Derek continued with obvious satisfaction, is to write a public statement acknowledging that your previous ethical concerns about corporate behavior were misguided and counterproductive. You'll specifically credit your time working directly with Sterling Industries for teaching you how genuine success is achieved in the modern business environment. Sarah nodded mechanically, her expression compliant, but her mind was racing with Jenny's instructions about documenting every conversation. The phone in her purse was recording everything Derek said, capturing his own admissions about the systematic nature of his manipulation and control. I understand completely, Sarah replied, her voice carrying just the right note of chastened humility. When do you need this statement completed? Tomorrow morning's board meeting with Alistair Finch and the other directors, Derek said. They're concerned about the negative publicity from last night's gala, and your statement will reassure them that the situation has been resolved professionally and permanently. Derek stood and walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline with the deep satisfaction of a conqueror surveying territory he had claimed through superior strategy and ruthless execution. Sarah, I want you to understand that tonight represents much more than your personal submission, he said without turning around. This is about restoring proper order to our industry. In my world, everyone has their designated place in the hierarchy. Those who accept their place and serve loyally prosper beyond their wildest dreams. Those who challenge the natural order get systematically crushed as examples to others. And what exactly is my place in this hierarchy? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer would be designed to humiliate and control her. You're my proof of concept, Derek said, finally turning back to face her with undisguised triumph. Living evidence that even the most idealistic and self-righteous people can be brought to heel when the stakes become high enough. You'll spend the next 5 years demonstrating that principles can be purchased and that moral convictions dissolve when confronted with sufficient pressure and incentives. Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and Sarah noticed her hands trembling slightly as Derek outlined his vision of complete psychological domination. Derek, Amanda said quietly, maybe we should discuss the specific operational details of Sarah's integration into the company structure. The operational details are simple and non-negotiable, Derek interrupted, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to having his every word treated as law. Sarah does exactly what I tell her to do, when I tell her to do it, how I tell her to do it, for the next 5 years. In exchange, her family enjoys unprecedented security and prosperity. It's an extremely fair trade. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Jenny. Recording equipment is functioning perfectly. Keep him talking about his systematic methods and anyone else involved. Derek, can I ask you something from an intellectual perspective? Sarah said, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than challenge or defiance. How long have you been refining these psychological techniques? The systematic isolation, the financial manipulation, the coordinated character assassination campaigns? Derek turned back to face her, his expression brightening with the pleasure of someone who genuinely enjoyed discussing his areas of expertise. You're asking about my methodology. I appreciate intellectual curiosity, even from defeated opponents who are now working for me. He returned to his desk and settled into his leather chair, with the air of a professor preparing to deliver a masterclass lecture to particularly attentive students. I learned early in my career that most people's resistance to authority is fundamentally superficial, Derek began, clearly warming to his subject. They'll fight passionately for their principles and values right up until those principles threaten their basic security or their family's welfare. The key to effective control is identifying what each individual person values most deeply, then systematically putting that thing at risk while offering protection in exchange for compliance. Derek opened a thick file folder on his desk, revealing what appeared to be detailed psychological profiles, complete with photographs, financial records, and behavioral analysis charts. Take Amanda, for example, Derek continued, gesturing toward his assistant with casual ownership. Intelligent, ambitious, profoundly insecure about her small-town background, desperate to prove she belongs in sophisticated metropolitan circles. I offered her access to power and luxury that she had never imagined possible, then gradually made it clear that maintaining those privileges required complete personal and professional loyalty to me. Amanda's face had gone pale, but she didn't contradict or challenge Derek's clinical assessment of her psychological vulnerabilities and motivations. Or consider your husband, Mike, Derek continued with obvious satisfaction at his own strategic brilliance. Frustrated writer, financially dependent on his wife's success, struggling with traditional masculine identity in a marriage where he's not the primary breadwinner. A few carefully placed doubts about your fidelity, some photographic evidence of potentially inappropriate intimacy, and his wounded pride did most of my psychological work for me. Sarah felt physically sick listening to Derek's casual dissection of her husband's insecurities, but she maintained her expression of neutral interest while the recording device captured every word. And me? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. You presented the most interesting intellectual challenge, Derek admitted with something approaching genuine respect. Most people are motivated by straightforward greed or primitive fear, but you were motivated by authentic conviction and genuine moral principles. That required a significantly more sophisticated psychological approach. Derek leaned forward, his eyes bright with the memory of his strategic triumph over what he clearly considered a worthy opponent. I had to prove to you that your convictions were not just wrong, but actively harmful to the people you claim to care about most. I had to force you to choose between your abstract principles and your children's concrete welfare, knowing that maternal instinct would ultimately triumph over ideological consistency. Derek, Amanda interrupted quietly, her voice carrying a note of desperate concern. Maybe we should focus on the practical aspects of tomorrow's board presentation. Should what? Derek snapped, his attention shifting to Amanda with sudden and dangerous intensity. Should pretend that what we accomplish here is anything other than the systematic application of superior intelligence and strategic thinking? Should maintain comfortable illusions about the true nature of business success? Amanda fell completely silent, but Sarah could see her hands shaking more visibly now, and there was something in her expression that looked like barely controlled panic. Derek's phone rang, the sound cutting through the tension in the office. He glanced at the caller identification with surprise and mild annoyance. Helen Sterling. My mother, he explained, his voice immediately shifting to a more respectful tone. This is unexpected. I should take this call. He answered the phone, activating the speaker function with casual confidence. Mother, this is certainly unexpected. What can I do for you this evening? Sarah couldn't hear the other side of the conversation clearly, but she watched Derek's expression change from confidence to confusion to genuine alarm as his mother spoke rapidly on the other end of the line. What do you mean, federal investigators? Derek asked, his voice sharp with sudden concern. Mother, slow down and explain exactly what's happening. Derek listened for several minutes, his face growing progressively paler as the implications of whatever his mother was telling him became clear. FBI agents? In the pension fund offices? Seizing financial records? Derek's voice was rising with each question. Mother, I need you to hang up immediately and call our legal team. Don't say anything to anyone until our attorneys arrive. The phone line went dead, leaving Derek staring at the device with the expression of someone watching their carefully constructed world begin to collapse in real time. He slowly raised his eyes to meet Sarah's gaze across his desk, and she saw something she had never expected to see in Derek Sterling's face. Genuine fear mixed with absolute certainty about who was responsible for his sudden vulnerability. You, he said, the single word carrying complete conviction and murderous rage. You orchestrated this. You've been working with federal investigators to destroy me. Sarah felt a moment of pure terror as Derek's fury focused on her with laser intensity, but then something else kicked in, something that felt like the anger Jenny had told her to find and embrace. I orchestrated what? Sarah asked with perfect calm, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Attending your meeting? Signing your employment contract? Agreeing to become your living proof that idealistic people can be psychologically broken? Derek was on his feet now, moving around his desk toward her with obvious predatory intent. But before he could reach her, his office door opened and Jenny Rodriguez walked in, followed by 3 other federal agents wearing FBI identification badges. Derek Sterling, Jenny announced with official authority, you're under arrest for witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violations of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. As the agents read Derek his rights and placed him in handcuffs, Sarah saw Amanda slump in her chair with what looked like profound relief mixed with terror about her own legal exposure. Sarah, Derek said as the metal restraints clicked around his wrists, his voice carrying the promise of future retaliation. This is far from over. You have no idea what kind of forces you've set in motion or what the consequences will be for you and your family. But Sarah was looking at Amanda, who was quietly crying into her hands while federal agents began photographing and cataloging the contents of Derek's office. Actually, Sarah said, her voice stronger than it had been in months, I think this is just the beginning of something much better than what you had planned. As Derek was led away in handcuffs, Sarah realized that her ordeal was far from over. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like she had allies and resources rather than just fear and desperation. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the marble hallway outside Federal District Court, adjusting the same sapphire blue dress she had worn to Derek's gala. This time, however, she was wearing it as the prosecution's star witness in what had become the most significant corporate fraud trial of the decade. The dress felt different now, not like a costume or a symbol of naive hope, but like armor worn by someone who had survived a war and emerged stronger for the experience. Mike appeared beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of nervous support that had become familiar during the months of therapy sessions and difficult conversations that had slowly rebuilt their marriage. The process hadn't been easy or quick, requiring honest examination of communication patterns, trust issues, and the ways they had both failed to protect their relationship from external manipulation. "How are you feeling?" Mike asked, handing her the coffee with the gentle care of someone who had learned to recognize and respect his wife's emotional states. "Terrified, determined, grateful, ready." Sarah smiled at her husband, meaning each word completely. All of those things simultaneously. Through the courthouse windows, they could see news vans lined up along the street like modern cavalry preparing for battle. Derek's trial had become a powerful symbol of corporate accountability and justice for systematic abuse of power, and Sarah's testimony was expected to be the emotional and legal centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Jenny Rodriguez approached them, looking professionally confident in her dark FBI suit, carrying a thick briefcase filled with evidence that had taken months to compile and organize. "Sarah, the prosecution team wants to review your testimony one final time before you take the stand," Jenny said. "Are you ready for this experience?" Sarah nodded, though her hands trembled slightly around her coffee cup. Over the past 6 months, she had learned that Derek's crimes extended far beyond her personal nightmare experience. Sterling Industries had been systematically looting employee pension funds to finance Derek's extravagant lifestyle and high-risk acquisition strategies. Dozens of employees approaching retirement had lost their entire life savings, while Derek purchased yachts, private jets, and luxury properties around the world. Amanda had become a crucial cooperating witness, providing internal documents and secret recordings that detailed Derek's methods for controlling subordinates and manipulating business partners. Her testimony had revealed a corporate culture built on fear, intimidation, and the systematic destruction of anyone who questioned Derek's authority or methods. "Has Derek's legal team changed their strategy at all?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jenny shook her head with grim satisfaction. "Derek is still refusing to accept any responsibility or admit wrongdoing. He's claiming that everything he did was standard business practice and that the federal government is criminalizing entrepreneurial success and competitive business strategies." Through the heavy courtroom doors, Sarah could see Derek sitting at the defense table, looking diminished in his orange prison jumpsuit, but still radiating the arrogance and sense of superiority that had defined his approach to the world. Even facing potential decades in federal prison, he maintained the expression of someone who believed he was being persecuted for his success rather than prosecuted for his crimes. "Sarah," Jenny continued, "I want you to remember that this trial isn't just about Derek Sterling, or even just about you. This is about demonstrating to other victims of corporate abuse that they can fight back against systematic manipulation and intimidation. Your courage to come forward despite the personal risks has inspired 23 other witnesses to testify about their own experiences." Sarah thought about the other witnesses she had met during the investigation. Mid-level employees who had been blacklisted and financially destroyed for questioning company policies, business competitors who had been driven into bankruptcy through illegal market manipulation, journalists who had been threatened with ruinous lawsuits for investigating Sterling Industries practices. "What's the latest information about the civil litigation?" Mike asked. 37 class action lawsuits and still growing," Jenny replied. "The pension fund victims alone are seeking $4.2 billion in damages. Derek's personal assets have been frozen, and Sterling Industries is being dissolved with its remaining assets distributed to creditors and victims." As they walked toward the courtroom, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that devastating night at the Grand Atoria Hotel. Mitchell Marketing Solutions had been rebuilt from the ground up, with Amanda joining as her business partner and co-founder of a firm specializing in ethical marketing strategies and helping companies develop transparent, accountable business practices. More importantly, the experience had taught Sarah and Mike to communicate more openly about their fears, aspirations, and the external pressures that could threaten their relationship. They had developed systems for making major decisions together, and Mike had found steady freelance work with publications investigating corporate misconduct and white-collar crime. "Mrs. Mitchell," A court officer appeared beside them with official courtesy. The prosecution is ready for your testimony. Sarah kissed Mike and walked into the packed courtroom, taking her place at the witness stand while hundreds of spectators, journalists, and legal observers watched intently. Derek observed her with cold hatred, but Sarah found that his intimidation tactics no longer had any power over her emotional state. Elizabeth Chen, the lead prosecutor, began with basic questions about Sarah's background and her initial business relationship with Sterling Industries. Then they methodically moved through the night of the gala, Derek's systematic destruction of her professional reputation, and his calculated psychological manipulation of her family's security. Mrs. Mitchell, when Mr. Sterling offered you the employment contract, did you understand it to be a genuine job opportunity? No, Sarah replied with crystal clarity, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. I understood it to be extortion. Derek had systematically destroyed my business and threatened my family's financial security, then offered to restore those things in exchange for my complete psychological submission to his authority. And when he described his methodology for controlling and manipulating people, did he seem to view these tactics as unusual or ethically questionable? Not at all, Sarah continued. He described them as standard business practices that demonstrated superior intelligence and strategic thinking. He seemed genuinely proud of his sophistication in applying psychological manipulation to achieve his personal and professional goals. Derek's lawyer objected repeatedly throughout Sarah's testimony, but her calm precision and the overwhelming supporting evidence made her credibility completely unshakable. She had documented every interaction, preserved every threatening message, and recorded Derek's own detailed explanations of his systematic methods. During cross-examination, Derek's attorney attempted to portray Sarah as a vindictive former business partner, seeking revenge against a successful entrepreneur. But the strategy fell flat against Sarah's consistency and the mountain of corroborating evidence. Mrs. Mitchell, the defense attorney asked with obvious desperation, isn't it true that you were attracted to Mr. Sterling's wealth and power? No, Sarah replied without hesitation. I was initially attracted to what I believed was a legitimate business opportunity. I was repelled by Mr. Sterling's abuse of his wealth and power to systematically destroy people who challenged his authority. When Sarah finally stepped down from the witness stand after 6 hours of testimony, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete honesty about who she was, what she valued, and what she was willing to fight to protect. 3 weeks later, Derek Sterling was convicted on all 17 felony counts and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Sterling Industries was dissolved completely, or its assets liquidated to compensate victims and creditors. Amanda used her witness protection settlement to establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping women escape exploitative employment relationships and providing legal resources for corporate whistleblowers. Jenny was promoted within the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, where she now specializes in cases involving systematic corporate retaliation against employees who report illegal activities. Sarah and Mike used their portion of the civil settlement to purchase a modest house in a suburb with excellent public schools, where Emma and Jake could grow up understanding that real security comes from personal integrity rather than financial compromise. The twins, now 7 years old, had adapted to their family's ordeal with the resilience that children often demonstrate, though they still occasionally asked why mommy had been sad for so many months. On the first anniversary of Derek's conviction, Sarah received a letter from him in federal prison. She threw it away without reading it, understanding finally that some people deserve neither forgiveness nor continued space in your thoughts or emotional energy. Instead, she spent that evening with her family, cooking dinner together and helping the twins with homework, while Mike worked on a book about corporate corruption and the ordinary people who find extraordinary courage to fight back against systematic abuse of power. The most valuable lesson Sarah had learned was one she hoped her children would never need to discover firsthand: that sometimes the only way to defeat a predator is to refuse to become one yourself, no matter how much easier or more profitable surrender might seem in the short term. Sarah had discovered that integrity, far from being a luxury she couldn't afford, was the one thing that had ultimately saved not just herself, but dozens of other people who had been trapped in Derek's web of manipulation and control. And that realization made all the pain, fear, and struggle worth enduring. The truth, Sarah had learned, was a weapon more powerful than all of Derek Sterling's money and connections combined. But it was a weapon that could only be wielded by people brave enough to use it, regardless of the personal cost. As she tucked Emma and Jake into bed that night, reading them stories about brave heroes who protected others from monsters, Sarah realized she had become the kind of person she wanted her children to grow up to be. Someone who chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and justice over personal safety. That was a legacy worth more than any amount of money Derek Sterling could have ever offered her. If Sarah's journey from victim to victor inspired you, hit that like button to support stories of courage over corruption. Share this with someone who needs to hear that even the most powerful predators can be brought down by the truth. And if you believe in justice over power, subscribe and ring that notification bell. Because next week, I'm bringing you another true story of ordinary people who refuse to stay silent against extraordinary abuse. Remember, in a world where billionaires think they can buy anyone's soul, your integrity isn't for sale. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption is simply refusing to be corrupted. I'll see you next week for another story that proves the truth is more powerful than money.